Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to have a somewhat short lecture on cowboys, cattle drives, kind of where this culture came from, and kind of how long the actual events lasted. Because we think this is a defining part of, Texas and Fort Worth culture. Being from Fort Worth or near Fort Worth in the DFW area, cows, cowboys, horses, all this kinds of stuff, this kind of Western frontier culture based around the cattle industry, we think of as kind of this iconic defining aspect of Texas. And it really is, and the West and all this other stuff. But the actual, while cowboys persist before, during, and after this period, the cattle drives is kind of this iconic image of the West, were for only for a very short period of time, maybe an outside number of about 20 years, but about 8 to 10 really big, busy years. So let's start off by talking a little bit about where white American settlers in the West learned how to be cowboys from. So it came primarily from the vaqueros. So these are Mexican cowboys. So these were the first cowboys in many ways. So it was the Spanish who brought, with Columbus's first efforts at colonization, brought cows and horses over. Both escaped, both went wild, and it's going to be the Mexicans, native peoples becoming and adopting cattle and horses and becoming some of the first and best cowboys. The best horse riders on all the Americas were the Comanche. They could ride like no other. What's crazy is the Spanish had horses for hundreds of years before they were reintroduced to the Americas with the Spanish colonization. The Comanche very quickly adopted that and rose to prominence as one of the most powerful native groups in America, certainly on the Great Plains, all because of the horse and what they could do with the horse. But going back to cowboys, so these vaqueros basically taught everything to kind of the white settlers of the West. When the English arrive and they start moving and coming into contact with regions that are good for having large scale cattle industry, large scale ranches, they're going to learn from, by this point, the Mexicans, from the Mexican vaqueros. Now, each South American country has like their own version of the vaqueros. So in Brazil, it's the gauchos. So if you ever eat at a Brazilian steakhouse, that style of clothing they usually wear, it's the gaucho. It's the cattle rancher of Brazil. In Chile, it's the huaso. And in Venezuela and Colombia, it's the llanero. Now, much like we get kind of the ranching culture from Mexico, we also get some of the most iconic aspects of this Western culture today, the rodeo, the rodeo, to ride. And this often was when people would round up and encircle the cattle, bring it all together to go take it to market. And while all the cowboys were gathered together, the vaqueros originally, they would show off with each other. They would show each other their prowess at, wrangling cattle, riding horses, or eventually riding bulls. So the rodeo we think of as, Texas, an American, a country kind of idea, but it's really a Mexican idea. So a lot of people separate those two concepts, but we really can't. We've really adopted big aspects of Mexican culture into the everyday life of America, particularly in big cattle places like Texas and like Montana and the big wide open places that we still have. A lot of the tools that are used, American cowboys got from the vaqueros as well. You have lances to round up the cattle called garrochas, so these big long stick kind of looking things. You have the lariat or the lasso. This is the traditional tool used to wrangle cattle. You make a slip knot on it, throw it around a cattle or a cow's neck, and you can take it down, or you can lead it where you need to go. The saddle. This is something fundamentally important. We all think, oh, the saddle is the saddle. It's where you sit to have your foot. And the stirrups. But the thing is, there's a horn on that saddle. If you see this picture right here, it's that little like leaf-looking thing right in front of the guy on the horse's back. It's a horn. And what you can do is, this is added by the Mexican vaqueros, when you lasso something, you wrap that rope around, or your end of the rope around that horn, and that cow is no longer trying to pull you, it's trying to pull a whole horse and you. So these like subtle changes Americans adopt when they start learning the ways of, cattle ranching and being a cowboy. So you have the mochila, which become known as chaps. So these are the leather coverings to protect your legs. You have stirrups. Now, stirrups are immensely important and they differ from different cultures all around the world, but stirrups are very important for guiding the horse and maintaining composure. And as a result of your stirrups, where your feet are kind of locked into these kind of footholds, if a horse gets scared and bucks you, you want to be able to get your foot out. But since your shoes are kind of locked in, you got to have certain shoes so that your feet can literally slide out if you get bucked, so that horse is not rolling over on you or dragging you. And this is where we get cowboy boots from. Cowboy boots don't have laces because you need to be able to slide out of them. So if a horse bucks, you want to slide out so you get thrown and not dragged or rolled over on or any of these other things. And you see what this guy's wearing, the serape or poncho, could be rolled or worn like a shawl, could be rolled up behind as a bedroll or used as a blanket. So it's this multi purpose tool, kind of something to keep you dry, all these kinds of things. This one blanket, this one tool kind of did it all. And we're going to see it time and time again all through cowboy history. Now, the kind of idea of the big ranch comes from the Mexican hacienda. And the leaders of the ranch, the head of the ranch, is what's known in Spanish as an hacendado, so the big landowner. Now, in Mexico, it's usually staffed by peons, often of native descent. And sometimes they're tied to the land, sometimes they're not. It varies depending on what state you are in Mexico. Now, it's almost exclusively a male job, very rare for a woman to be a vaquero or a cowboy or a cowgirl in that context. Now, some Plains Indians do become cowboys as well. The Comanche become some of the greatest herders in the plains. So they run huge head of horse and different other animals, so massive herds. Now, the vaqueros, as a culture and as kind of an identity and job profession, last until today. So predominantly in South American, mostly Mexican American settlements and regions. So if you go down to the valley, you see this a lot. This kind of hacienda, vaquero style culture still exists, and it's a defining aspect of many of these communities. So the Cowboys, as we kind of remember them in Wild West movies and all these kinds of things, learned pretty much every aspect of their culture, of their trade from vaqueros. And they adopted what worked, they modified it to meet their needs in different situations, but this is huge. Now, Texas cattle are unique as well. Texas develops what's known as the Longhorn, and this is a wild cattle, not as wild as, say, antelope or buffalo, but still wild in many ways. To be a cowboy, this is a hard, dangerous life. You're out, managing these cows off on your own for long periods of time. It might be 2, 3, 4 people out alone for weeks or months at a time. So you have hostile Indians, you have angry farmers, you have all these kinds of things that they're trying to deal with. So it's not exactly a glorious job. Typically, if you're a cowboy, you're not doing it because you love ranching. If you're the cowboy and not the ranch owner, you're doing it because you don't have a lot of other options. You're typically out of work, out of money, you're probably on the run from the law. So these are rough, rough guys for the most part. That's why you see some of these same cowboys going and becoming Texas Rangers once they formed the Texas Rangers, because they wanted the roughest, toughest guys that could go out in these frontier regions and endure and survive. Now, one section of cowboy culture that isn't talked about a lot are black cowboys. So many African Americans moved west to places like Kansas, looking to escape the hardships of the Civil War and the memory of slavery. So they want to move west, get out of the deep South. And some of them make a go at farming, some of them try ranching, and some of them, particularly young men, just like many white young men, many black young men turn to being a cowboy as a viable option because they could go run several cattle drives, make a decent amount of money, and maybe buy a piece of land of their own. So this gives a lot of people a chance to go do and have something they may not have had otherwise. While it's a hard life, it's a high risk life, the rewards could be pretty good. So the cattle drives, this is kind of the peak of cowboy culture in America. So this is where we had all these wild herds of various types of cows, longhorns included, but various types of cattle that were relatively unclaimed due to Mexican ranches in northern Mexico having been raided by the Comanche. A lot of cows escape, they reproduce over the years, you have these massive herds. So the cowboys, you have a ranch owner or kind of an entrepreneur kind of guy, puts together a team of cowboys, they go round up a bunch of these cattle, and then they drive them from, northern Mexico, southern Texas. So you kind of see this red region down here, and they drive them up to places like Waco, Fort Worth. This is where Fort Worth becomes a major hub. So there's a fort there called Fort Worth, named after a General Worth from the Mexican-American War. But they're driving these all the way up to Ellsworth and Abilene, Kansas, sometimes later to Dodge City. But Abilene's kind of the big one because there's a railroad hub in Abilene. It's going to be a few more years before the railroads make it to Texas. So this is one of the big ones, the Chisholm Trail. If you've driven around Fort Worth, you know the Chisholm Trail. It's the highway. This is where they gets that name from. It kind of follows that part of that same path. So for a few years, this was big business. Each year you go round up hundreds or thousands of cattle, drive them for weeks or months up to these railroad hubs, sell them, load them up, and then they'll ship them to places like Chicago, where they would butcher them and distribute the meat all around the United States. So this is where we first start having the kind of big mass production of beef. This is when beef really becomes available and heavily consumed by the United States. And while there's a ready supply of meat for a while, eventually ranchers are going to have a huge demand placed on them because once Americans get a taste for American beef, they want more and more of it. Now, what's going to end these cattle drives? So this lasted for about 5 or 10 years. So kind of the mid to late 1800s is kind of when it hits its peak. And by the 1880s, you kind of have refrigerated train cars. By 1900, you could really ship these. You could butcher a cow in Chicago and ship it all around the United States without too much trouble. What really ends the cattle drives, while railroads help, once railroads get to South Texas, that's really going to make a big change. But barbed wire. So as people settle Texas, farmers and even ranchers begin fencing in their land. This cuts off a lot of the big avenues, particularly the water sources that these cattle driving cowboys used. And this starts what's known as range wars. This is when you have cowboys and farmers actually killing each other for access to these waterways, through these throughways, all these kinds of things. Now, the kind of big shift that's going to come right at the end of the big cattle drives is Native Americans. So the Indian Wars, because the Civil War is over, you have a group of people moving west. So you have farmers moving west to settle this western land. You have the cowboys and ranchers settling it, and they're all running into these Native American groups. In the south, you have groups like the Comanche. In the kind of middle region, you have groups like the Cheyenne. And the north, you have the Sioux. So you have these dominant, powerful, large nations that are going to give the U.S. Army a run for its money, particularly the Comanche and the Sioux are going to put up ardent resistance against the United States. Because think about it. Texas has been butting up against the Comanche for 200 years. And it's not until after the Civil War where we can turn the full force of the U.S. Army plus all the new technology, new revolving guns, repeating rifles, railroads, telegraph, all these kinds of things focused on the Indians to finally defeat them. Now, it's kind of a sad story how this all plays out, but we'll save that for another lecture. So I hope you enjoy getting a little bit of a glimpse into cowboy culture, which is so important to us here in Texas. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up next time.